Hello, everyone. This is Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School. And today I would like to make a case for a somewhat unpopular defense to e4, which is the Nimzovitch line, knight c6. In this particular position, this is the only move that Black can play where a lead in development can be achieved on move one. Knight f6, you would think, could do the same thing, but of course, this knight is immediately under attack with e5. So this is not a great way to get a lead in development, but knight c6 is the only move that gains Black a lead in development on move one. So I would like to make a case for this move. One of the great things about this move is that it really limits White's choices. White is basically down to playing either knight to f3, pawn to d4, or knight to c3, copying Black's last move. Any other move that is typically played after e4 is somewhat weaker. Like, for example, if the person that plays e4 is a type to play f4 on this particular move, runs into d5, and this is known to be a reasonable line in the Scandinavian defense where both sides have thrown in an extra move, but it turns out that Black's move is a little bit more useful than f4. If a person plays e4 with the idea of playing bishop to c4, and there's lots of players out there that do this, then this is running into an immediate or futuristic e6 transposing to some sort of French defense where d5 will eventually gain a very important tempo. So this means that knight f3, d4, and knight c3 are the only moves to really be worried about after knight to c6. Okay, so let's start with the classical knight to f3. All right, in this position, in reality, Black's best move is e5. Now, this isn't a very interesting subject. Of course, everybody, there's many videos, much information about this position, transposes to all kinds of different openings. But what I would like to say about this particular move order is, for those of you in the Seattle Chess School that likes to meet e4 with e5, if you play knight c6 first, and after knight f3 only now play e5, you have avoided a fair number of several, dangerous options. For example, if you play e4, e5, f4 is possible. Now, you might have a really great answer to the King's Gambit, but if you do not, then knight c6 followed by e5 avoids this. The straight up Vienna game is avoided because White will already have the knight on f3. The bishop's opening with bishop c4, but without knight f3, is also avoided. The center game and gambits, Danish Gambit, Goring Gambit, any of those have all been avoided because of the knight coming out to f3. So with this, you've also avoided the queen h5 attack, which of course isn't the scariest thing in the world, but there are some people that like to play this and play it seriously and have serious ideas behind it. If you can tempt the knight out to f3 first, this blocks out queen h5 and all the other, and the King's Gambit and all the things I just mentioned. So we get to this particular move order, and then you would only have to have a defense to the Scotch and the Lopez and the Italian game and the 3 and 4 knights game. But you have seriously limited the number of options that could be played against you. Okay, now I will offer two other options here. One is to play d6. There are people in the world that seriously play this opening. And the idea is to have easy development with the knight and the bishop, and then decide what to do with your e-pawn in order to develop your dark bishop. So for example, something like d4, knight f6, knight c3, bishop g4. I'm not even certain that there's a name for this particular opening, but it is somewhat non-bookish. And there are numerous, there's options with g6 or e6 or e5, and you have a slightly different position than normal with adequate development. So this is something that you could choose from. If you want something a little bit more exciting, there is what is known as the Colorado Gambit, which is f5. Now, I'm not going to rehash theory in this position. There are many great videos on YouTube featuring f5. And basically, the idea with this move is when white accepts this pawn, that it is something like a king's gambit in reverse, where black is attempting to play d5, followed by bishop takes f5, followed by e5, with something like a perfect position. To give you guys an example of this, in this opening, the king's gambit, it is well known that if black accepts the gambit and white plays knight to f3, and if white is allowed to basically play d4 followed by bishop takes f4, that white has a like almost winning game. Like, for example, let's just give a couple of nondescript moves for black here, like d6 and knight d7. And if white is actually allowed to capture the pawn back, this will, especially with a couple more natural moves, bishop c4, knight c3, and castle, white will basically have a perfect position here. Total command of the center, supreme development, counterplay all over the center and king side, good attacking chances. This is essentially what black is trying to get out of the Colorado Gambit. If white accepts the gambit, black should play d5 to immediately collect the pawn back. And if white plays this listlessly, say something like d3 takes and bishop to e2, and black is allowed to achieve the similar structure that I just showed with the white pieces, then it is black who is going to get the perfect position and lots of chances for the attack. Okay, now this would be all great and wonderful, except if you're going to play this particular line, there is one line that in particular that is most dangerous to this gambit, which is the very simple d4, which of course prevents e5 for a very, very long time. You just simply give the pawn back and then pin the knight with bishop to b5. If you're going to play this gambit, you should concentrate your fire here, your study. This is what you want to study. You want to study this particular position, because this is the absolute best that white can do, and it really limits black's counterplay. Now, generally speaking, in the information that is available, queen d6 is a possible move. E6 is also a possible move. The idea with e6 in this position is to play knight e7 and protect the knight, because it is going to get pig-piled on with knight to e5 at some point. So we can bring a knight over to help defend. Queen d6 actually has the idea of defending in this way, but having some possibility of transferring the queen to g6 with certain attacking possibilities. Okay, but in reality, this line is the best that white can do. And if you're going to play this gambit, you got to start your studies here. After knight e4, knight c6, besides knight f3, there is d4, which of course is natural and good and seizes the center and all the other great things that the two-pawn center allows. All right, now here, black historically has had two moves. Someone out there might be able to invent a new move in this position, but the two typical moves are e5 and d5. E5, I wouldn't personally trust. Now, of course, one option that white has is just to transpose to the Scotch, which is perfectly good, especially if you know what you're doing here. But the move that I would be most concerned about is white capturing, which is interesting because this transposes back to the Englund Gambit, which is another popular YouTube favorite, which comes out after d4, e5, capture, and if knight c6, then white in this position would play e4 to transpose back to our position. And e4 is not necessarily the best move in this exact position. I mean, white, of course, can develop and defend the extra pawn and so forth. So we'd be transposing back to a line that, most people would not play e4 in that position. But nevertheless, I don't think that, I mean, I've tried like playing like a queen h4 style gambit here, with the idea like if they defend the e4 pawn that you go after this attack, or you could play bishop c5 or capture, just kind of jokey lines where you're just trying to invent something. I would certainly say that capture in f4 is not in black's favor. And also, white doesn't even have to capture in these lines, e4, knight c6, d4, e5. White could also play d5 and transpose to the two knights tango defense, which this line I don't think is doing theoretically very well for black. So with this particular line, I think d5 is by far the best move here. And again, black is fighting for a lead in development very early in the game. All right, so in this position, white typically has three moves. One of them will transpose back to the two knight c3 line. But first, we will look at just the very simple capture. Okay, so this, of course, leads to queen takes d5. And here we have a Scandinavian defense, one where in this position, it would be e4, d5, e takes d, queen takes d5. And instead of playing the traditional knight c3 or the logical and good knight f3, white here would play pawn to d4. Okay, well, so, and then we would play knight c6 and then transpose back to our position. Now here, black clearly has a lead in development, although the centralizing of the queen is in question because it is going to get attacked at some point. Now, because of the attack on d4, this means that white should defend d4. The most typical way is knight to f3. If you can encourage your opponent to play c3, this takes away any knight c3s, and any future knights pawn c4 is going to be an extra tempo. So we would love to see this. It also doesn't stop black from counterattacking in the center with pawn to e5. So this type of move we would already not be concerned about. Knight f3 is logical. And again, to keep a development lead and keep pressure on d4, we can play bishop to g4. All right, now this is where the theory of the position really starts. I'm not going to get heavy into this at all because there are many adventures here. For those of you that watched my Veresov video, you would notice that with knight c3, bishop g4, and the queen being developed, that we actually have a Veresov in reverse. So a lot of the ideas will remain there. Like, for example, engineering castling queen side, which not only adds extra pressure on d4, hopefully if our opponent will castle king side, it will give us an opposite side castling position where we can actually try to play for an attack on the king side. So for example, bishop to e2 castles. Now in this position with castles a lot of times there is a real threat to d4, such as removing the guard on f3, bishop takes, and then queen takes d4. For those of that have never seen this position before, you might have thought that you could have done that on the last move, but this is a very classic trap where if you captured one move too early and white captures back and yay, we win a pawn, but whoops, we lose the game. So this is why castling is necessary. Not only does it bring the rook into the game, but it makes it so that the king isn't on e8, making bishop takes c6 check. So we just simply avoid that. Now here, this is where if you're going to play this position, you will also want to concentrate your fire starting on this position. White has a variety of ways to use their center or protect it, such as bishop to e3. There is c4s immediately. There are knight c3s immediately. And this, like I said, this is where you'll want to start your studies on how to maneuver your queen around in some cases. I'll give you one example. Like here on c4, it seems as though the queen f5 is a really excellent move, even though we have queen a5 check, which is also a playable move. In some cases, queen h5 is really excellent. Adding pressure to the king side, especially if white castles over there. Queen f5 in these cases actually threatens knight to b4 with a certain invasion. and so forth. But this is where you will want to begin. And one thing that can be liked about Black's position is, again, the lead in development, and we've already castled our king. Can't ask for more, out of the first 5 moves of the game. So the second move that can be played instead of e takes d is e5. Now, this looks very Caro-Kann-ish, except for the fact that there's not a pawn on c6, there's a knight on c6. But in this position, we play the very Caro-Kann-ish move, bishop f5. And here we've, with the arrows, we've demonstrated kind of the strategy that, or the central strategy that Black is going to employ. And then whatever happens from here, it is basically the game of chess. Pawn to e6, of course, will make room for a knight to come to e7 or develop the dark bishop to b4. Pawn on f6 will attack the head of White's pawn chain rather than the base, which is kind of an interesting strategy. So, for example, if pawn to c3, we have a French defense where the bishop is not blocked in on c8, but rather out. And in many of these cases, what Black will do is actually attack the head of the pawn chain rather than trying to play pawn c5, c takes d4, and try to attack either the b2 pawn or the d4 pawn. Once again, Black does get a lead in development, and a lot of light square control on the king's side. One example here would be queen to d7. And if f4, Black can play a move like h5 and control all of the light squares on the king's side and center with interesting play. There are certain tricks involved with this particular type of setup. So, for example, if knight to c3 and e6, again, trying to make room for bishop to b4 or knight ge7, whichever is needed. Sometimes there are certain errors that can be made. For example, if White plays knight e2, which actually happened in a game of mine once, which isn't the most desirable development, this already loses to knight to b4 with a simple double attack on c2 that can no longer be defended. So now, of course, this is not a realistic move that you'll face all of the time, but there are certain tactical tricks with these developed pieces, bishop f5 and knight c6. In most cases, Black will try to castle on the queen side, although if you can develop the knight and the bishop, like bishop to b4 followed by knight e7, then certainly you can make room for kingside castling with a really super French with the bishop on the outside. And lastly, there is knight to c3, which in my opinion is White's best move. Now, in here, it looks like that Black could capture on e4 and make a double attack on the d pawn with the knight and the queen. However, after capture and d5, I believe that this position is actually better for White. And collecting the e4 pawn back is not going to be too difficult for White. In the meantime, White will have some open space for both his bishops and good attacking chances. So the only move that I think is of any interest in this position is e6, which leads to what is known as, well, known in some circles as the Riefschlager French. Riefschlager is the last name of Helmut Riefschlager, who evidently played this position for several decades. Against all e4 players, pretty much. And so here, the transposition would be like this: e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, very classical position. And instead of playing knight f6, which is the classical French, the win hour with bishop to b4, or the d takes e4 line, Black opts for knight c6, which of course is not the most popular move. One of the reasons why it's not popular is that in many cases, Black needs to counterattack the d4 pawn with the c5 pawn by playing c5, and this move, of course, blocks this plan. Now, on the other hand, one great thing about this particular setup for Black is that it actually blocks out almost all, I would say very nearly all attacks, which means that I'm saying that Black actually has a really, really good defensive position here. So there is no attack on f7. There's really no way for white to combine on any square or make tactics on any square. So black will have a perfectly defensible position for a very long time. The other thing about this is that it could also lead to different creative attack. Well, not necessarily. What's the word I'm looking for? It could lead to several creative positions where, like, okay, well, let's just get into the moves. Here, let's just show you what I'm talking about. If white plays e5 and locks this up, then black can actually transpose to a line in the win hour that I actually used to like when I was a teenager. So that would be to play bishop to b4. And the object here is to have a setup with queen to d7, b6, bishop to b7, and castles long. So to be all of these moves. So I'm going to give white some nothing moves here just to demonstrate this particular setup. So let's say bishop to d2, knight to f3. Let's say bishop to b7 here, castle and castle. Okay, so let's just say white just plays it sensibly and just tries to develop pieces. The object is to get this particular setup. And this is something that I borrowed from the pages of former world champion Tigran Petrosian, who played this way many, many years ago. And from this position, when we add two more moves, king b8, and let's say, let's just give him rook to e1 and play rook to c8, then what we have here is a mirror image King's Indian defense, or a light squared King's Indian defense. Normally, we would have all of this, basically this whole setup here, but on the dark squares rather than the light squares. And, you know, knight b d2, and we could actually have something like a King's Indian attack with the black pieces. So here, and with the closed center, we would have very similar ideas and plans. So transposing from a French defense to a King's Indian defense just on the opposite side of the board. So this is one possibility that you can get from the Riefschlager. Now, after moves like, say, knight f3, this will basically force black to commit to some sort of development, either bishop to b4 or knight to f6. Knight f6 is very popular here. And then after e5, in order to make this position work, black actually has to play somewhat aggressively with knight to e4. But even here, once this knight exchanges itself off for something, and black is able to either once again complete the b6, bishop b7, queen d7 plan with castles long, or bishop to d7, queen to e7 with castles, black should have a perfectly reasonable position. In some cases, you again can play for an f6 plan to try to hit the head of the pawn chain. There are some cases where a good move is knight to a5, followed by pawn c5 to finally get the c5 pawn involved in the attack, as you would in a normal French style. And so in order to do that, to clear the knight out, a lot of times the good square is knight a5, depending on circumstances. But this should lead to more of a position where you'll be cramped somewhat, but you will have a perfectly defendable position for a long time, and there's no chance of you getting completely run over. So without going too deep in any line, I will allow the viewer to explore this for themselves. I would say, as a practical weapon, knight c6, I think, is really excellent as a surprise weapon. I mean, there are those that use knight c6 exclusively and have it as their only opening in their repertoire. For those of you that play something other than knight c6, perhaps this video will help convince you to use it as a one-off weapon that you can use. I would say that knight c6 is a really excellent opening against those that do not care about opening theory. And you know who you are. Those that are very proud to say, oh, I don't read chess books. Oh, I don't go through, articles or anything like that, or try to learn openings. I just play chess. If you're playing that type of player, knight c6 is excellent. You'll get positions where you'll have instant leads in development, and your opponent will have no real clear way to take advantage of it. So hopefully this will be helpful to somebody. Anyway, this has been Coach Matt for the Seattle Chess School, and this has been making a case for the Nimzovitch defense. We shall see you guys on the next one.